My name is Emily. I recently turned 18 and still live with my parents in a vast California mansion. Wealth has always been part of our lives. We never worried about money or where our next meal would come from. My father works in real estate, a man whose rough edges and blunt speech often hide a courageous heart. My mother is a gentle, caring teacher who runs our household with steady kindness. For as long as I can remember, life felt secure and even idyllic inside that comfortable home. Then, without warning, everything shifted. On a day when thick, somber clouds rolled across the sky, my mother and I were in the kitchen preparing dinner and waiting for my father to come home after a long day. The kitchen felt cozy. Steam curled from my mother's simmering soup, and the aroma wrapped around us like a blanket against the chill beyond the panes. That small domestic peace was shattered by the abrupt ring of the phone. My father was calling. I froze while my mother answered. Her voice flattened as she listened. Only moments later, the world as we knew it began to unravel. My father sounded different on the line, his usual certainty stripped away, his voice trembling. He told us his business had collapsed into bankruptcy, that his accounts were drained, and that he had no way to keep paying for the house. He said, plainly and sharply, that he had to sell the mansion to cover debts. Those words hit like thunder. I watched my mother's face go pale, then crumple into a mask of worry she tried to hide. Everything we had, our home, the rooms that held a lifetime of small memories, suddenly hung in the balance. My father's next instruction felt like another blow. Tomorrow, you too must move. Go live with your grandfather in the countryside. We still have a shelter there. The idea of leaving shocked me. My grandfather lived in a place I rarely visited. After my grandmother died, he had remained alone in a house that had long since fallen out of fashion. My childhood memories of him were warm. He used to lavish me with attention, treating me like a cherished treasure. But so many years had passed that his face in my mind had become soft around the edges, less distinct than it once was. The next morning we packed as much as we could and left the life we'd known. It was only my mother and me in the small car. My father had gone elsewhere, his destination unnamed. As the city skylines faded behind us, the neat lines of pavement gave way to rougher country roads and wide-open fields. The world outside the window shifted from bright glass towers to the raw, unpaved stretches of a different kind of living. The silence in the car pressed on me like a physical thing, heavy, claustrophobic, full of what-ifs. When at last we arrived, an old mansion rose before us under a washed-out sky. Time had taken its toll on the roof. Tiles were stained and worn. The plaster had crumbled away in places, revealing the red brick beneath. I felt a small, uneasy pang in my chest as we stepped into the overgrown garden edged with fruit trees. The front door creaked open, and my grandfather appeared in the doorway. He was thinner than I remembered, his shoulders a little more curved, his face lined deeply. His eyes, though, were the most striking change, older somehow, sharper, and carrying a look that made me pause. He smiled when he saw us, and for a moment the old warmth bubbled up inside me. As a child, he had been indulgent and playful. He used to tease me and lift me onto his knee. Now his expression felt different. Kinder in one way, yes, but also more intense, almost curious in a way that unsettled me. We greeted him and followed him into the house. Inside, everything was an echo of another age. The furniture was plain, the ornaments scarce, but everything had been arranged with careful deliberation. He had taken the time to sweep, to straighten, and to make a bed for my mother and me. It lacked the opulence of our previous home, yet there was a curious, homely warmth about it. At first my grandfather was gentle and attentive. He fussed over small details, told us stories from the past, and helped my mother settle into the rhythms of the house. The days at first were simple and measured. He seemed to take pleasure in the small, ordinary tasks of hospitality. But as the days lengthened, I began to notice something in his manner that gnawed at me. Whenever I stood before a mirror, smoothing my hair, or sat reading beneath a tree in the garden, his gaze would find me and linger. Sometimes I would look up to find him watching, still as carved marble. The look in his eyes had altered from the doting softness of a grandfather into something more scrutinizing, almost deliberate. At first I told myself not to read into it. Perhaps I had changed in ways he did not recognize. Back in the city, I had favored practical, comfortable clothes. Here I wore slightly more fashionable things, an attempt to retain who I was even as circumstances shifted. Maybe the sight of the 18-year-old version of me unsettled him. Perhaps age had sharpened his attention and made him more observant. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than a generational difference, a private eccentricity, and that rural life simply had a different cadence than what I was used to. One quiet afternoon, with my mother gone into town for errands, I lay on the battered sofa in the living room. The upholstery had seen better days, and yet the cushions cradled me with a surprising comfort. I had just finished reading a book that had captured me for days. Through the window, thin rays of sunlight slipped into the room, mapping a small golden rectangle on the floor and lending the place a hushed, almost sacred light. Lost in the final paragraphs, I hardly noticed the tiny creaks and whispers of an old house. Then my grandfather entered. He came carrying a dish crowded with fruit, neatly peeled slices of apple, pear, and orange arranged like small, bright offerings. He set the plate down on the low table beside me and smiled. "Eat," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Fruit is good for you. Eat plenty. It will keep you strong." I raised my head, returned his smile with a brief, grateful one of my own, and took a slice of apple. For a moment, I let the familiar rhythm of small gratitude ease the tension in my chest. Grandfather had always had a way of showing care through small actions, and I appreciated the thought he put into this one. I sank back into the sofa and resumed reading, feeling the book's words fold me in. But he did not sit and speak as he often did. Instead, he took the chair opposite and watched me. Not the casual, affectionate watching of an older relative, but an intent, unwavering gaze that felt as if it could dissect me. At first I ignored him, telling myself he simply wanted to sit quietly. Minutes went by. The stillness swelled. Then his voice, gentle and almost private, cut into the silence. "You've grown," he said. The words themselves weren't strange. Anyone might observe that a child had become a young woman. But in the cadence there was an undercurrent, something that made the ordinary comment feel like a measurement, like the final count on a scale. He watched my face as if cataloging details I could not see. I found myself lowering the book and searching for an answer, for some casual response to settle the strange air. But I couldn't bring myself to speak easily. The room, the garden, even the fruit on the plate seemed to tilt a little, as if the house were holding its breath with us. From that moment on, the feeling of being under inspection shadowed the rest of my days in the house. Small moments that once would have passed unnoticed now felt heavy with meaning when his gaze fell across them. I began to measure my movements, aware of how my clothes hung, how I tucked my hair behind an ear, whether I laughed too loudly. The domestic rhythms, which at first carried a comforting simplicity, now came threaded with a disquiet I couldn't fully name. I tried to dismiss these sensations as the product of my own nerves, the fallout of sudden loss, the abrupt removal from the life I'd always known. Maybe I was being overly sensitive, I told myself. Still, the peculiar intensity of his stare persisted, and with each day it seemed to grow more focused. And though my grandfather continued to perform small acts of care, arranging meals and listening to my mother's chatter, the tenderness I remembered from childhood had shifted into something more ambiguous, a watchfulness that made me feel exposed beneath the kind, old roof of his home. As dusk settled and the house grew quiet, I found myself wondering when and if the comfortable certainties of our former life might return. Even as I held on to the threads of normality my parents tried to weave, the unfamiliarity of this place and the changed look in my grandfather's eyes reminded me that everything had been altered. The old mansion held itself steady in the twilight, and inside it, I learned to be careful with my movements and cautious with my smiles. The days that followed were simple outwardly, but inwardly they were threaded with the quiet tension of a changed relationship and the uneasy feeling of being observed. He called me remarkably beautiful. I lifted my eyes to meet his, and a small, Involuntary smile curved my lips. Indeed, time flows quickly, he said softly. A warmth spread across my cheeks at the compliment, but as his look lingered, I felt that familiar unease tighten in my chest. The eyes that once brimmed with indulgent affection had altered. They no longer felt like the benign, doting gaze of the grandfather I remembered. Instead, they carried a quality I could not name, a quiet intensity that made me want to step back. He spoke with a low, measured voice, as if drawing a careful line between observation and confession. "Your eyes remind me of your mother when she was young," he murmured, "and yet you are your own person, different in ways that make you remarkable." I managed a timid smile and tried to hide the heat rising in my face. "You flatter me," I said, forcing a laugh. "I'm nothing special." I kept my gaze on the book in my lap, as if the printed words could anchor me to something ordinary. My words did little to settle him. He pressed on, as though compelled to fill the air with reminiscence and appraisal. "I remember when you were small," he said, eyes traveling over my face, "how you used to run through the garden, chattering without end. Now, in just a few years, you have become a young woman, elegant and poised." I gave him a polite smile, my heart pinched with embarrassment. It felt strange hearing my own body described so plainly. "Back then, those were such happy times," he continued, voice soft with memory. "You have beauty and grace. Any young man would be captivated. I only wish someone worthy and capable would care for you." Heat rose to my neck. My hands trembled as I turned the page, pretending to read though the letters blurred. His compliments, though courteous, sat heavy on me like an accusation I did not understand. "I'm still young," I answered finally, trying to steady my voice. "There's no need to think about such things now." He smiled, a brief, knowing expression, and rose from his chair. "You're right," he said lightly. "I'll go out to the garden for a while." Relief flushed through me at his departure. His leaving felt like the lifting of a weight. I waited until his footsteps faded before I lifted my head and scanned the room. The quiet settled back in, but an insistent unease had wormed into my thoughts. The book at my fingertips no longer held my attention. My grandfather's voice and the way he had studied me over and over crowded every sentence. His praise, however kindly intended, lingered like a question I could not answer. After that conversation, small things grew harder to accept. His eyes no longer held the soft warmth of the man I had adored as a child. Instead, they struck me with an intrusive sharpness whenever he looked my way. I told myself I was being paranoid, that loss and upheaval made me twitchy, yet whenever he stood nearby, the distrust and confusion in my chest swelled until it was difficult to breathe. One morning my mother left for the city again. She said she needed to help my father with urgent matters. After she went, the house felt oddly hollow. My grandfather, who had usually been content to sit in the living room or wander the garden at a distance, seemed determined to remain close to me that day. His behavior puzzled me. It felt less like benign company and more like a deliberate strategy to be near. By the third day without my mother, the house's stillness pressed against my skin. That afternoon the sun filtered through the orchard trees, scattering flecks of gold across the grass. I had settled beneath one of the fruit trees, book in hand, hoping to lose myself in the story. The garden was beautiful in the way it always was. Birds caroled somewhere in the canopy, and a soft breeze teased the leaves. But the scene only heightened my unease, for I found myself preoccupied with my grandfather instead of the prose. Then I heard it, a faint sound behind me, the soft padding of feet on the grass. My breath stuttered. I turned slowly and saw him approaching, his steps unhurried and deliberate. He came closer until he stood only a few paces away, watching me as if testing the space between us. My instinct screamed to rise and move, to put distance between his presence and mine, but my limbs felt rooted. "Grandpa," I called, my voice small and wavering. He stopped and looked down, his expression folded into something that was no longer simply familial. His tone dropped, rich and intimate, as if he were speaking only to me. "I like you, Lily." The words landed with a force that stunned me. Confusion and a cold spike of fear threaded through my mind. He continued without shame or hesitation, each syllable a bolt of disbelief. I have never met a woman as exquisite as you. You are flawless, your eyes, your skin, your smile. You've become perfect. I stood frozen. His praise felt obscene coming from him, familiar features rephrased into desire. Up close, I could hear the soft rise and fall of his breathing. His gaze burned with a hunger I had never seen on his face. I could not speak. My heart hammered so loudly I thought he must hear it. For a moment the garden, the birdsong, everything around me narrowed to that single, impossible accusation that the man who had once held me like a child now regarded me with want. He stepped in until I could feel his presence close enough to touch. His fingers, thin and weathered, reached toward mine and curled around my hand. The roughness of his skin sent a shiver through me. "Lily," he murmured, his voice thick with feeling. "Do you know I desire you? I want you to be with me." His words vibrated with a weight that made me dizzy. My limbs were numb, my chest constricted as if wrapped too tight. The world blurred around the edges. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened just enough to stop me. The old safety I had once felt with his touch ruptured into alarm. I do not remember how long I stood there, trembling. 1,000 frantic thoughts rushed through me, each one a frantic plan to escape, to call to my mother, to scream. Yet none of them sank deep enough to make my feet move. He drew closer again, speaking in tones that mingled hurt and hunger, pressing his words like a net around me. The garden, once a place of play, had turned strange and treacherous. Something in me finally stuttered into motion, a small, decisive step backward. The movement, though slight, was a start, but his hand tightened, and his eyes watched me with an expression that made my skin crawl. I realized then that the man who had once comforted me was someone else now, and that the house we inhabited sheltered a tension I could not let myself ignore. When I looked at him, I no longer found the familiar tenderness of a grandfather's gaze. Something unexpected and wrong glimmered there instead. Panic unfurled through me as I tried to pull my hand away, but my fingers felt leaden, my muscles refusing to obey. My thoughts raced, frantic for a path out of that tightening circle. "Grandpa, you can't do this," I said, voice trembling but firm. "I'm your granddaughter." He stared at me with a strange blend of surprise and wounded expectation, as if my words had surprised him more than offended him. "I have thought about this a long time," he replied quietly. "You have become a beautiful woman. I only want to be with you, to protect you, to love you in a way I never loved anyone." His confession spilled out as if rehearsed for years. I stepped back, hands still shaking. "Grandpa, I can't. You're my grandfather. We can't. Please stop." The words were a plea and a command at once. For a few suspended seconds his expression changed. Desire faded into something heavier, remorse. He loosened his grip on my hand with visible reluctance, eyes dropping as if ashamed. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice cracked and small. "That was wrong. I don't know what came over me." He gave me one last look, raw with regret, then turned away and walked into the trees until his figure blurred between trunk and shadow. I stood motionless, the world around me hollowed by shock. My heart hammered, my breath came shallow and fast. Relief washed over me in ragged waves when I realized he had left, as though I had just been wrenched free from a nightmare. Still, the memory of his voice and the pressure of his fingers lingered like an aftertaste. From that moment, a new caution settled over me. I no longer felt brave enough to meet him directly. If he came into the room, I slipped away. Fear and confusion warred inside me, and I could not decide if I should tell my mother what had happened. The space between us widened, filled with a fragile, aching imbalance. Fortuitously, that same day my parents returned. My mother walked in smiling with news. Things in the city had been resolved. My father's work was back on track, and we could go home. Relief at her words flooded me. The heavy dread that had shadowed me for days loosened its grip. When my father arrived, beaming and declaring that everything was restored, we began packing to leave. As we prepared to depart, I glimpsed my grandfather in the garden. He stood at a distance, head bowed, sorrow gathered in his posture. When our eyes met, there was a brief, fragile exchange, his gaze full of apology, mine full of an ache that could not be easily named. He did not approach. He stayed rooted in the yard like a lone sentinel. That image haunted me through the drive back to the city. My mother sat close beside me, chatty and relieved, asking kindly about the past days. I answered in short phrases, the words tripping out because I could not bear to voice the whole truth. Outside the window, fields and fences slid by in a soft blur, but my mind kept returning to that one searing view, my grandfather standing small and solitary beneath the fruit trees, his silver hair stirred by the breeze. He would return to the hush of his empty house, to the quiet life he had always kept, now more isolated than before. Guilt and sorrow knotted in my chest. I could see, beneath his error, a man who felt shame and remorse. He had harmed what he loved most, and his sorrow was unmistakable. The line between love and transgression had been crossed, and neither of us knew how to mend what had ruptured. Both of us needed time to breathe, and perhaps to heal, if healing was even possible. As the car pulled away, I turned my face forward and tried to tamp down the tumult inside me. The journey home was quiet. My mother's voice was a soft reassurance I only half heard. I stared at the passing landscape and replayed the final scene in my head, unable to dislodge the image of him standing motionless in the garden. That picture lodged itself under my skin, a heavy, irremovable thing. From that experience, I learned a hard lesson about boundaries and courage. Families are sacred, but love must be governed by respect and limits. If someone makes you uncomfortable, you must find the strength to speak up. Silence can let harm grow roots. Trust your instincts and protect yourself by turning to people you trust when you feel unsafe. Preserve relationships that are built on mutual respect, and do not let loyalty silence you when your well-being is at stake.